Please support me on Patreon. Link is in the description below. In August of 1939, Soviet and German negotiations culminated in the signing of two agreements, the German-Soviet Credit Agreement and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The first was essentially a trade deal, with the Soviet Union providing Nazi Germany with raw materials such as oil, grain, metals, and Germany providing industrial equipment in return. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, however, was, on the surface, a pretty standard non-aggression pact, with the two nations promising not to attack one another and that they wouldn't ally with each other's enemies. But beneath the surface, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had a secret protocol, carving up the spheres of influence between the two nations. Most importantly, the Soviet Union was promised the Baltic countries, Finland, and eastern Poland. On the 1st of September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland from the west, and 16 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. 19 days later, Poland surrendered and was split between Nazi and Soviet occupation, as the agreement had promised. So, I recently had a discussion with popular leftist YouTuber Vosh on this topic, or more specifically, the question of whether this cooperation between the Soviets and Nazis constituted a non-aggression pact or a military alliance. I encourage you to go check that discussion out, but in this video we will explore that topic a little more deeply, so let's get into it. To answer whether the Soviet Union and the Nazis had a military alliance or a non-aggression pact, we should probably start out with what is a military alliance and what is a non-aggression pact. This is of course a difficult topic in its own right. The personal definition I am working off of would be something like this. A non-aggression pact is a formal agreement between two or more nations to not declare war on or engage in any military maneuvers against one another, with a military alliance being a formal agreement between two or more nations to offer each other active support in the case of an attack. By this personal definition, I don't think Soviet-German cooperation could be framed as a military alliance. They had no formal promise to aid each other in the case of an attack. But let's use a hypothetical example to see whether this definition holds up. So, China decides to invade Vietnam. However, before they do so, they contact the US and offer a proposal. China and the US agree to both invade Vietnam and carve it up along pre-arranged borders and sign a non-aggression pact to avoid them entering into a conflict. To solidify this agreement and further avoid conflict, the US and China signed some pretty significant trade deals. Now, are the US and China, in this example, now allies? I would say no. In my eyes, these are two competing superpowers, two competing imperialist nations, setting their differences aside because it benefits both nations' imperialist ambitions. To me, this would be a non-aggression pact with trade deals and military collusion baked into it. To me, this just describes one form imperialism can take. But alright, enough of my definition. Let's look at what actual academics say on the topic of what makes an alliance. Stefan Bergsmann takes a shot at defining the term military alliance with this mouthful. An alliance shall be defined as an explicit agreement among states in the realm of national security in which partners promise mutual assistance in the form of a substantial contribution of resources in the case of a certain contingency, the arising of which is uncertain. That might sound complicated, but hopefully doesn't lose too much meaning if I simplify it to a military alliance consists of states making a formal agreement in the form of a promise to substantially aid each other if a military crisis such as war was to occur. By Bergmann's definition, which I encourage you to read up more on, the Soviet Union and the Nazis did not have a military alliance, since they had no promise to aid one another if a military crisis was to occur. But why do some people insist that this still counts as a military alliance? I think the disagreement comes from a difference in definitions and the perception that a non-aggression pact has to purely be a promise not to attack one another, and that if there are other substantial deals on top of a non-aggression pact, it kind of automatically turns into an alliance. The Soviets and Nazis had a non-aggression pact. On top of that, they colluded militarily, as seen in the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the partitioning of Poland. They traded significantly, as seen in both of their major trade deals, and had some technological exchange, but all of that combined still don't make them allies. They can have the non-aggression pact and all of those other things alongside that pact without being allies. They are imperialist nations in the same region who've wanted to avoid conflict, since Nazi Germany was busy elsewhere and the Red Army was a mess at the time. It was within the scope of their imperialist interest to do those things, but that doesn't mean they are allies. In my eyes at least, two nations can collude or cooperate militarily without being in a military alliance. The Berlin Conference, the carving up of the borders of Africa into different spheres of European colonialism, comes to mind as an example. To me, a military alliance requires a promise and principle of mutual defense, something the Soviets and Nazis never had, and to me, a non-aggression pact is a promise not to attack one another, but can also involve a broader cooperation and other treaties without automatically turning into an alliance. However, it is important to note that the Soviet-German cooperation, despite not being a military alliance, did cause a lot of suffering. For the duration of their cooperation, the Nazis and Soviets had a rather extensive trade program, which helped fuel the Nazi war machine, quite literally actually. One of the Nazis' main issues during World War II was fuel shortages, and the Soviets exported a lot of oil to the Germans. Basically, even if it wasn't a military alliance, it is still important to remember that the Soviets did help the Nazis maintain their war efforts. Even though it only made up for a small portion of German production, the Soviet Union still helped supply many of Germany's early conquests and atrocities, including Soviet trade goods being used to help supply German troops in the eventual Operation Barbarossa. Now we'll get on to something I'm sure some viewers have been waiting for me to bring up: the German-Soviet Axis talks, which took place in October and November of 1940, and they were all about one thing: the Soviet Union becoming an official Axis power. And this sounds like a very big deal on paper, until you see what the actual proposals put forth consisted of, and just how much of a failure the negotiations were. Germany proposed an agreement that was super vague, to say the least, and large parts just repeated stuff from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, like Axis nations would respect each other's spheres of influence and wouldn't join any alliance aimed at another Axis nation. The two new agendas brought into this agreement was carving up new spheres of influence, urging the Soviet Union to go south into Iran and Iraq, kind of leaving the rest of Europe for Germany, and that the Axis powers should assist each other in economic matters, which is just very vague and hard to judge in terms of how substantial it would actually be. The Soviet reaction to the German proposal was that they were immediately concerned over several issues, most importantly the fate of the Balkans and Turkey. The Soviets sent a counter-proposal which involved increased trade, Soviet control of Bulgaria, Germany pulling back troops from Finland in return for a Soviet guarantee that they wouldn't attack Finland, purchasing back territory from Japan in return for compensation, and finally, in accordance with Germany's proposal, they would be focusing their expansion on Iran and Iraq. In response to this, Germany never responded, and that was the end to the German-Soviet Axis talks, and in less than a year, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Yeah, from my perspective, the importance of the German-Soviet Axis talks have been largely overstated. And note one very important thing. Based on the two proposals we have, had the Germans and the Soviets reached an agreement, it still wouldn't have been a military alliance. The Soviet Union would officially have been the fourth Axis power, but nothing in these proposals has a promise of mutual defense like the other Axis powers had. I think the German-Soviet Axis talks were largely irrelevant. I think the main consequence of a hypothetical agreement would have been increased Soviet-German trade, which in turn would have led to more British and Soviet casualties. But on the large scale, I don't think it would have changed much. I think the Nazis would have stuck to invading the Soviet Union at roughly the same time, regardless of the conclusion of the German-Soviet Axis talks. They already had a non-aggression pact after all, and they were fully willing to break that. The Soviet Union was not socialist, but the Nazis sure thought they were, and viewed the Soviet Union as a blight upon the world, born of a Jewish conspiracy that they had to destroy, and in an immediate sense, they were both imperialist nations who sought domination over the same spheres of influence, and the Soviet Union had many natural resources that Germany wanted to lay their hands on. The issue with arguing semantics, as much as I love doing it personally, is that there is of course no strictly correct answer. What I and Bergsmann would call a military alliance, Volker, Krause, and J. David Singer would call a defense pact, and they would consider non-aggression pacts and defense pacts to just be different forms of military alliances. I disagree with that definition, but what really matters to me in the end is that Nazi and Soviet cooperation is presented correctly, and the reality is that the level and depth of Soviet-German cooperation is often understated and overstated in different spheres. I just think personally that there are many better ways to describe their cooperation than the term allies. Thank you for watching. I have a lot of thoughts on this topic and might do more videos on it in the future. Please comment and tell me what you thought about the video and offer suggestions about topics I could cover in the future. Please like the video, comment and subscribe if you enjoyed it and want to support me. My Patreon and PayPal are linked in the description below, but until next time, I hope you have a lovely day.